Imagine yourself in the trenches of World War I. It's Christmas Day, 1914, and the world around you is immersed in chaos and death. But then, something unexpected, almost magical happens. The gunfire stops, enemies cease to be enemies, and soldiers, torn apart by war, cross the no-man's land, separating the trenches to shake hands, exchange gifts, and play football. This is the incredible story of the Christmas Truce of 1914, a unique moment of humanity amidst the barbarity. Let's start from the beginning. World War I, initially known as the Great War, broke out in the summer of 1914, when Europe became engulfed in an unprecedented conflict. Tensions among the continent's major powers exploded when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated. Within weeks, the main European nations were at war. The German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, known as the Central Powers, were facing off against France, the British Empire, and the Russian Empire, which formed the Triple Entente. Over time, new contenders joined the conflict. The war quickly transformed into a static and brutal struggle, marked by the construction of trenches, particularly along the infamous Western Front, which stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland. By December 1914, millions of soldiers were trapped in these trenches, enduring horrific conditions such as extreme cold, hunger, disease, and the constant fear of death. Hopes for a quick war had evaporated, and the initial fervor among some soldiers was giving way to deep exhaustion and despair. In this context of suffering, something unexpected occurred. The Christmas Truce of 1914, a surprising event that was neither official nor planned, in which soldiers on both sides spontaneously decided to cease fighting to celebrate Christmas. It is difficult to pinpoint exactly how it all began, whether it started at one point on the front and spread, or if it arose simultaneously in various locations. In any case, it is believed to have originated somewhere in the Flanders region, and the spark was likely ignited on December 23rd, Christmas Eve's Eve. On that day, German soldiers brought Christmas trees out of their trenches and lit candles. Then, they began singing carols like Stille Nacht, Silent Night, whose melody was also known to British soldiers on the other side of the trenches. Surprisingly, the British soldiers, upon hearing the German carols, responded by singing their own Christmas songs. Soon, the men were shouting greetings and even jokes to their enemies. The tension began to dissipate. The following day, December 24th, Christmas Eve, some low-ranking British officers ordered their men not to fire unless fired upon first. However, the most astonishing event was yet to come. On Christmas Day, December 25th, a few German soldiers dared to peek above their trenches and wave their arms in a gesture of peace. Finally, seeing they were not attacked by the British, they bravely stepped out of their trenches and ventured into no man's land, the desolate ground that separated the two sides. In some areas, the separation was less than 50 meters. Against all odds, there was no gunfire. What happened next seems like something out of a novel, but it is documented in letters and diaries from soldiers on both sides. The British soldiers decided to come out of their trenches, and after approaching, they shook hands with the Germans. Then, they began to share some of their few possessions, such as cigarettes. They also exchanged small gifts, like simple pieces of chocolate. Some men even swapped uniform buttons as souvenirs of this unique moment. In some sectors, the truce extended beyond mere courtesy. Soldiers worked together to bury the dead lying in no man's land, offering a brief but heartfelt tribute to the fallen from both sides. One of the most famous and debated episodes of the truce was the impromptu football matches played between German and British soldiers at various locations along the front. The details vary according to different accounts, with differing results and scores. But regardless of who won, what mattered most was the symbolism. fierce enemies setting aside their hatred to share a few hours of fraternity. However, these harmonious moments of peace were not to everyone's liking. The high commands on both sides were furious when they learned of the truce, fearing that fraternization with the enemy would weaken troop morale. Still, one must ask, why did the truce happen? The first factor to consider is that, by December 1914, the soldiers had spent months in very harsh conditions. Many were tired of fighting and were looking for any excuse for a ceasefire, even if it was brief. Additionally, Christmas was a deeply rooted celebration in European culture. Both Germans, British, and French shared similar traditions, which facilitated emotional connection at that time. Thirdly, despite being enemies, the soldiers shared a common experience of suffering. Living so close together, they could hear the voices and see the faces of their adversaries, which humanized the other. Last but not least, the chain of command was less rigid in 1914 than in later years, granting greater autonomy to soldiers, and above all, to low-ranking officers on the front line, who were ultimately the ones who allowed this truce to take place. Another intriguing question is, how widespread was the truce? Here it is necessary to distinguish between the Western and Eastern fronts. On the Eastern Front, where Germans and Austro-Hungarians faced Russians and their allies, the truce was not as successful, mainly for two reasons. The first is that the movements of the front line were much more frequent than on the static Western Front, making it difficult to develop continuous and lasting relationships between the opposing enemies. Secondly, while on the Western Front both sides shared a similar religious and cultural heritage, on the Eastern Front there was a greater cultural diversity, which may have made agreements like the Christmas truce more difficult. In fact, in 1914, the Russian Empire still used the Julian calendar, so the celebration of their Orthodox Christmas did not take place in December 1914, but in January 1915. Focusing on the Western Front, the Christmas truce did not extend across the entire front, but occurred primarily in areas where the British and Germans, especially Saxon Germans, who had a certain reputation among both sides for being trustworthy, were facing each other. In areas where Germans faced the French, although the truce was somewhat followed, it was less so, possibly due to the marked hostility between them because of the significant advances the Germans had made in French territory in recent months. Regarding the duration of the truce, in the most fortunate sectors, it lasted until New Year's Day 1915, but in most cases, it lasted less time. Nevertheless, the high commands soon took action to stop it from happening again, preventing nearly all attempts at soldier-initiated truces for the rest of the war. Moreover, it is also true that, due to the many casualties, the soldiers became hardened and increased their hatred towards the enemy over time, so they were also not as predisposed to ceasefires as they were at the beginning. In the end, that Christmas truce of 1914 did not change the course of the war. But today, 110 years later, it is still remembered as a symbol of hope in the midst of one of the most brutal and deadly conflicts in history. It has been immortalized in books, songs, films, and even advertisements. However, what is truly important is the message it leaves us. In the darkest and most terrible moments, human beings can still find a small space for fraternity, even if only for a moment.